Bonjour à toutes et tous, vous écoutez SuperFriends, votre podcast comics préféré pour une nouvelle émission du format Super Friends. C'est dans ce podcast qu'on va à la rencontre des personnes qui font vivre la pop culture et la culture comics par leur travail. Aujourd'hui, on a le plaisir d'accueillir dans le podcast Ezra Claytan Daniels, l'auteur de Âme Augmentée, un énorme roman graphique paru en début d'année chez 404 Graphiques et dont on vous a dit le plus grand bien. On va donc revenir avec lui sur cette œuvre. Bien entendu, cette interview, elle est en anglais et donc on se retrouve avec Ezra juste après le générique. So that was my quick introduction. Hello, Ezra. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm still pissed because I was late at this interview, but I will be all right. So this is the first time that we speak together. So I'm always obliged to start with the most basic question. Who are you, Ezra? Could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, my name is Ezra Claytan Daniels. I'm a writer and cartoonist from Los Angeles, and Âme Augmentée. Is that the pronunciation?
Yeah.
Okay. I've been saying it wrong. I've been pronouncing syllables incorrectly, but yeah. So this is the French adaptation, or not French translation of my first major graphic novel, Upgrade Soul, in the U.S. And yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about yourself and comic books? What was your relationship to comics when you were growing up? Did you always wanted to be a comic book, a cartoonist?
Yeah, I grew up reading comics. I was always a big fan of Marvel and DC comics when I was a little kid. I grew up in a small town in Iowa in the US, and comics and cartoons were always a big part of my life. When I was in high school, I had a comic in the school paper. But I was actually always a bigger film fan than I was a comics fan. And I really wanted to make films. I actually moved to Portland, Oregon to go to art school to study film. But I had always suffered from social anxiety. And I found it just really daunting to make a film and like be in control of a whole production. And because I was able to draw and I had a little bit of a background in drawing comics for my school paper and just like drawing a lot as a kid, I found it a lot easier to draw the stories that I wanted to tell, because I could just lock myself in my bedroom for 6 months and come out with a complete story. And I didn't have to worry about managing personalities or working with actors or managing budgets. And I could imagine anything I could possibly do, and I could turn it into a comic book. And so that's why I started doing that. And I started drawing my own comics. And Upgrade Soul was my second graphic novel. My first graphic novel, I don't really talk about anymore because it was more of a learning experience than something that I really stand by. But yeah, Upgrade Soul was the first like really big thing that I did.
But would you say that you liked comics because you could do everything also on the page, that you had no limitation in terms of imagination, in terms of storytelling? Is that something that attracted you also?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And something like Upgrade Soul is a great example because it's a pretty small story with a lot of grounded human characters, but imagining how you would create the clone characters in live action would be really challenging to do. But in comics, I think there's just a lot more leeway to create something visually that kind of defies reality and defies logic, but people will buy into it because of just the nature of comics and the nature of illustration.
But moments before, I'm sorry, you talked to me about your experience in Hollywood also. Mm-hmm. So you still managed to become a writer for TV and films. Yet you still want to do comics now. Can you like explain to us what's really what is it really like to do a comics versus doing a TV series, for instance?
Yeah, well, yeah, I've been lucky enough to, after Upgrade Soul came out in the US, it made a little bit of a splash in the comics industry and was nominated for some awards. I sold the film rights to it, and I got an agent, a TV agent and a manager, and I started doing some screenwriting stuff. And yeah, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream to work in film and TV. And it was an incredibly different experience working in film and TV than working on comics, because like I said, with a comic book, I have control over everything. And Upgrade Soul is, it's just like a completely unfiltered expression of my identity. But going from that to working in a writer's room with 10 other writers who are all throwing out ideas at the same time. And like, there's all these maneuvering egos, not only in the writer's room, but once you write something, then it goes off to the studio and you get notes from the studio, you get notes from the producers, you get notes from the director, and then the actors bring their interpretation to it. It's really exciting, but it's just a completely different writing experience. And there's just so many more so many more rules to follow and so many more things you have to consider when writing for film and TV.
And yet, the first idea you had for Upgrade Soul wasn't exactly a comic book in physical format. It has also a soundtrack. So you wanted to approach things differently, it seems, with this like very big first project.
Yeah. So the first version of Upgrade Soul was I was working on Upgrade Soul for a long time, trying to find a publisher for it, and I just wasn't getting any traction on it. So a friend of mine came up with it.
I'm just interrupting you because people have to know that it's been a story of 15 years, more than 15 years in the making. So
we've been working on it for a long time. But yeah, so I was working on it for a couple of years, trying to find a publisher for it, and couldn't find anybody to put it out. So a friend of mine came up with an idea for an interactive iOS comics reader and asked me if I wanted to adapt the pages I already had for it. And I did that, and we put that out in 2012, which was a long time ago. But that was the first version of Upgrade Soul. And that version had an interactive score by a composer named Alexis Gideon. That was really special.
Do you feel like music can enhance the way you read a comic book?
I think so. In this case, yeah, I think there's something about music that just enhances the emotions of something. And I think the experience of reading Upgrade Soul in the app with there's some slight animation effects, like some really, really subtle animation effects in the iOS app. But like the panel to panel transitions with the music, when you've got headphones on looking at your screen, it is a really extremely immersive experience. And I do think even when I'm reading comic books, sometimes I like to listen to music, especially like music that feels like it might fit the comic book, like movie soundtracks and stuff like that. So I do think that there's just something about music that can potentially enhance any kind of narrative experience.
To dive into the thematics of the album, there's a lot to say, obviously. The first thing is this idea of upgrade. Like it's a comics where two old people want to project themselves into better versions of what there should be. And it creates like these two monsters that are technically themselves, but upgraded, yet still, I don't know how you say, uncanny. You feel embarrassed when you're with them. It's a weird concept. How did it come to be?
The original idea for the story came to me when I was in my early 20s. And I had just moved to Portland, Oregon to go to art school from a small town in Iowa where I don't want to say I was a big fish in the small town, but it was a small enough town that like I was known as the artist guy. And so when I moved to Portland, I had this kind of inflated ego and an inflated idea of like how good I would be in art world. And as soon as I got to art school, I found that I wasn't the best illustrator. I wasn't the best writer. I wasn't the best speaker. I wasn't the smartest. And this idea of being outclassed at everything that I thought I was the best at was a terrifying thing for me in my early 20s. And I came up with the idea for Upgrade Soul around that time. And I just wanted to capture that terror that I felt. And I wanted to transpose that terror into characters that were based on my grandparents. And I felt like my grandparents, who I was very, very close to, had been experiencing a similar terror in aging out of the workforce and like being outclassed by younger people coming up under them that were better and smarter and faster than them at everything that they had made a career in. And that's where the idea came from. And I just wanted to try to capture that terror. And I think the look of the clones was something I spent a lot of time thinking about, but it was something that I wanted it to feel weird and uncanny, but I also wanted it to feel appealing in a weird way. That's why I based the designs on babies, because because there's something like irresistible about babies. So there's an element of irresistibility to the clones, I think, but they also like, obviously the idea of 3 foot tall, orange mutant babies is a little bit scarier than normal babies. So I really wanted to play with this like push and pull of like, it's like something you are drawn to, but also repulsed by at the same time.
And there's also something about the handicap in this book, because you have these characters that seem like they're abnormal, and yet the male one, especially like wants to see himself as a full human being, although he's disabled in a way. And you have also another character, which I won't spoil, that embodies this idea. Nowadays, we talk a lot about the handicap with the Olympics, etc. Why is this element there? Why is it like so important to the story in the end for the transition of one character in particular?
Well, I think one of the things I'm trying to get at with the definition of identity is kind of defining identity by the way that you're allowed to move through the world. And I think disability and race and gender are factors that are both inherent to a person's identity, but also superficial, and that they can be read by other people from outside. And those other people that read those identity elements can allow you or disallow you to move through the world in certain ways. And I think that was a big part of my definition of identity for Upgrade Soul. And I think disability was a big part of that, because I think someone who has a disability that can be read by other people, that person is going to be treated differently as they move through the world. And the idea of separating yourself from that, like if you went through a process that removed those superficial indicators of your disability or race or gender or whatever, like how would that change how you move through the world? And then by extension, how would that change your identity? Because your experience of life would be completely different.
And there's also a debate between one of the character and his clone about this idea of this. He doesn't have the black skin color anymore. Mm-hmm. So he feels free to liberate himself from the struggle and the history that comes with it. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a harsh scene. We feel like the clone in this scene is being something like a monster, but it's not something you wanted to go with, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that scene where there's a lot of ideas explored in Upgrade Soul that I don't necessarily agree with. And some of the stuff is just like the character of Henry specifically being an antagonist and trying to agitate someone and trying to like take the piss out of someone to get the upper hand intellectually over them. But I think that these are interesting ideas to explore. I don't know if I agree with what Henry is saying in that particular scene, but I do think it's an interesting idea to think about.
And it really seems like you put a lot of yourself into this book in terms of identity speaking, because if we read your postface, you speak about the black identity in your family. And how much did you like balance the way you wanted to put personal stuff in this story and also just tell a story to not to be only a story about yourself or your fears?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I really thought about balancing that, but I think by virtue of spending as much time as I did with Upgrade Soul, it was inevitable that there'd be a lot of me in it. And I think there's also, like the core themes of Upgrade Soul being exploration of duality, which is something that I feel is, the idea of duality is something that I explore in basically everything I do, coming from a mixed race background. I think that it was crucial for me to come up with a theme for Upgrade Soul that was deep enough and complex enough for me to want to come back to work on the story for as long as I did. And it was great that I did that because it ended up taking me so long to finish, but it was something that I never got bored of because it was just an idea that I would always find new angles to look at or new layers to add on top of it. So I think that it's an extremely, extremely personal story that is buried under lots of genre tropes and trappings, but I think at the heart of it, it's very autobiographical.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you, because there are all these themes, but on the surface, it has a structure that evokes, in a way, the science fiction movies from the 70s or 80s or 90s, especially like the work of David Cronenberg with the idea of the man that's transformed into a creature like the fly. You say you're a film buff, if I understand you. Did the cinema of maybe Verhoeven or Cronenberg or Carpenter have any influence on this particular comics?
Oh my God, yes, absolutely. It's all over the comic. I think like even setting the comic in the 90s was kind of a nod to like my favorite era of sci-fi filmmaking. But yeah, everybody that you just mentioned, David Lynch is another big influence. I think specifically David Lynch's Elephant Man was like a hugely foundational movie in my just like creative career. I saw that movie when I was probably 10 or something. And it just like really left a huge impact on me. And seeing echoes of the Elephant Man in something like The Fly, David Cronenberg's The Fly. In fact, on the cover of Upgrade Soul, the machines that they use to do the process are inspired by the machine design in The Fly. So there's a lot of nods to those guys in this book.
So you mentioned in another interview that you liked psychological horror for the comics format because you can't do jump scares with comics panels. But how do you make a panel scary or just a page?
Well, I did say that in an interview. I think with Upgrade Soul, I was really trying to create more of a boiling unease type of horror rather than like a jump scare horror. I think part of that was just like really leaning into the emotions of the characters and the psychology of the characters and just the philosophical existential terror that they were facing. I also wanted to set some limitations for myself aesthetically with the book in terms of designing the art. So one of the limitations I set was that I would never use any black fields in the book. So like a typical thing that horror movies and comics do is they like cast things in darkness and try to rely on what you can't see to scare you. But in Upgrade Soul, I wanted to cast everything in just bright fluorescent lights. I wanted everything to be like fully on display. And I think that was a way to force myself to find other ways to make something unsettling.
And there's also a precise use of coloring in these books, especially the green tones and the yellow tones who come back repeatedly. Just like in a movie, it seems like you've done some sort of cinematography to shape the things into a certain atmosphere that I think participates in the uncanniness of the whole plot. How did you choose this particular setting of colors, including to your limitations?
That's a great question. Upgrade Soul was the first comic I did in color, so I had to think a lot about how to approach that. I wasn't in art school long enough to really study color theory, so it was something that I had to kind of teach myself. And I wanted Upgrade Soul to have an aesthetic that the color aesthetic that I had in my mind when I first started drawing Upgrade Soul was I wanted it to look like a rock poster, like a faded rock poster, like a rock poster for like a show that you would see in the window of a bar that had been like just left up in the window of a bar for 20 years. And like all the colors had just like tweaked a little bit. So what I did with Upgrade Soul was I came up with a color palette of like 10 basic colors, like a box of children's crayons. Just like, these are the 10 basic colors that I want to use. And they were all like slightly tweaked and like distorted versions of the basic color. So instead of red, it'd be like a slightly like faded, more bricky red. Instead of blue, it would be like a little bit more turquoise. So everything was just tweaked a little bit. So that was my basic color palette for the book. And every scene in Upgrade Soul uses those same 8 colors, but then every scene in the color has an overlay. For like, there's one overlay for like indoor scene. There's one overlay for outdoor scene. There's one overlay for a nighttime outdoor scene. So I had like 8 overlays that I would lay over in Photoshop that would just alter the colors even more. So they'd all have a consistent feel, depending on where the scene was and when the scene was. So I had a different color overlays for like flashbacks and a different color overlay for present day scenes.
And the same can be said about your choices for panels. It seems like you have a structure that maybe it's because of the digital screen format to begin with, that we see that you have, like in comics, we can sometimes have characters that overlap over 2 panels. You have a really straight and narrow use of it, which I think participates also in the setting of the mood, because it's like a more like we observe these characters from afar and there's no really input from you in terms of judging them using the breakdowns. Mm-hmm. Is that something you wanted to do consciously?
Yeah, totally. And I think you just nailed it. Like that, I think a big part of Upgrade Soul is not judging the characters, and I wanted everybody to be presented on equal footing. And so I didn't want to rely on, like low camera angles on a character to make a character look heroic. I wanted everything to be very like anesthetic and sterile. Like another reference point I used for the look of the book was like airplane safety manuals and like technical illustrations and stuff like that. Like I wanted to look very medical and very precise and very unemotional, because I wanted the reader to be able to project their own feelings and stuff onto the characters. But you're right. The panel structure was originally a limitation of the iPad screen size, because the original version of the story was made for iPads. But I think I adopted that aesthetic and that really extremely rigid panel structure really kind of more of as a creative choice than a technical limitation choice, because it did allow me to, like I said, just make everything feel very like, I think I'm one of the things I'm proud of with Upgrade Soul is I think it's a really easy book to read. Like a lot of people tell me that like it's like a lot of people have problems reading comic books if you don't come from a comic book reading background, especially when you do things as a comic book artist where like characters are overlapping panels and like panels are weird shapes and like it's hard for people to understand the flow of how to read a comic book. And I have a background in informational design. And so I have a background in like technical illustration and like charts and graphs and stuff like that. That was my day job while I was working on Upgrade Soul. And the whole idea with art like that is like creating images that can be read from across the room in 30 seconds and understood from someone who doesn't understand like what the chart or graph is necessarily about, but they can understand the information being imparted. And so with Upgrade Soul, I wanted to create a reading system that like someone who'd never read a comic book could understand like this flow of information, because it is so repetitive and so rigid that there's not really, I'm not trying to like jump through crazy like creative hoops in the design of it. And yeah, hopefully it added to the just like the sense of unease.
So Upgrade Soul came by a very different stage, because at the beginning you wanted someone else to draw it, then you decided to draw it, and it was first in black and white, and then you went to colors. And I wanted to know, in this whole process that lasted like 15 years, was it exciting? Was it challenging for you to just rework on panels and just go back and do researches for certain characters to develop some thematics, or was it at some times discouraging? I just wanted to if you remember your state of mind during the whole process, because it seems to me that it was I don't know, 15 years. It's
a long time. Yeah. in the first couple of years, it was really discouraging because, like I said, I did a comic book. I did a graphic novel called The Changers before I did Upgrade Soul, and The Changers was well received in the comics community. It got some really good reviews. It was distributed by the National Comics Distribution Service or whatever. And I felt like I would have a good chance at selling a graphic novel idea after the success of a self-published book that I did prior to Upgrade Soul. So for the first couple of years, I started working on the Upgrade Soul pitches. And when it didn't go anywhere, I started to feel discouraged. But then once I came to peace with the idea that I might never find a publisher for this book, and that it might just be like a labor of love that I'd work on nights and weekends, then it kind of became more of a security blanket where I'd never felt bored for 15 years, because if I ever like ran out of things to do, I'd be like, oh, I could just go draw a couple pages of Upgrade Soul. So it just kind of became this comfort thing that I had. And honestly, when I finished the book, it almost felt like a loss, because I wouldn't have this security blanket anymore. I wouldn't have this thing to like always fall back on to chip away at. And especially toward the end of the production of the book, like, you know, having amassed over 250 pages of like fully illustrated full color pages, like it was really like I developed a sense of pride when I would go back and like look at the pages I'd drawn and like look at the file, like the folders on my computer of like all these color pages that I did that and nobody paid me to do it. I did it all on my own. And it was just like this like thing that I did just for the love of doing it. So yeah, I didn't feel discouraged. I don't think, like after the first couple of years of rejections, it just felt like something that I became increasingly proud of.
And do you know why it was rejected at the time? Because the market has evolved a lot now, and I think that maybe if you would start Upgrade Soul today, it wouldn't be rejected as it was 15 years ago.
I would like to think so. I don't know why it was rejected for as long as it was, because I don't know what conversations went on behind those closed doors. But I suspect it. I mean, the traditional wisdom probably would dictate that a story about an elderly interracial couple and their disgusting clones wouldn't sell very well. Like, there's no hot people in Upgrade Soul. There's no fist fights. There's one punch and there's a squeeze that is violent.
It's quite a
yeah. But I could see how a typical editor might look at a pitch like this, and just especially coming from like someone who I wasn't a name, like nobody knew who I was. I could see how it'd be easy to reject a book like this.
Could you tell us how the relationship went with 404 Comics, who does the book in France?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty hands off. I didn't have much of a relationship, but yeah, they got the book from my publisher Oni and sent me some ideas for the cover and stuff, and it was looking cool. So I didn't really have that much interaction with 404 until I made plans to come to Paris for a wedding. And I was like, I'm going to be in Paris. Can we meet up and maybe do some comic book stuff? So yeah, it's been great since I got here.
You mentioned that you sold the rights to Upgrade Soul in the US. So without like burning anything that will eventually be announced eventually, you said you were afraid like to be in a sort of a big project for Hollywood because you're not the author solo anymore. So do you, if the movie happens to be made, do you like fear that it won't be as much as your book as it is now anymore?
No, because I made the book. In the book, like no matter what happens with the movie, even if they turn the movie into like a movie with a bunch of sexy people and fist fights, like, I'll always have the book. So,
okay. And I think it's a standard question, but what do you plan to do now that you've done the book?
Well, I've been working in film and TV for a while. I worked on a TV show called Doom Patrol for a couple of years. I've got more film and TV stuff coming out. I started writing some comics for Marvel. I did a Wolverine comic that just came out last month. So I hope to do some more stuff for those guys. And I've got a new graphic novel coming out that we haven't announced yet, but it's coming out next year. So we'll be announcing that soon.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Ezra.
Thank you so much. This is great.